What's up, guys, and welcome to the Level Health Podcast. Today, Josh is interviewing Lauren Conlin, physique coach, owner of Loco Fit and IFBB Bikini Pro. She has a master's degree in exercise science and just had some research published recently from when she was working in Bill Campbell's lab at the University of South Florida. This episode, we talk all about balancing competitive success and long-term health for competitors and non-competitors alike. Lauren is full of great information, so if you're a coach, especially if you work with female physique athletes, this is the episode for you. Big thanks to Lauren for coming on the show. You can follow her on Instagram at Lauren Conlin and at Team Loco Fit. We'll have both of those linked in the description below. You can also listen to her podcast, Team Loco Fit Roundtable. For those of you that don't already know, our website, Level Health, is a directory, community, and network of qualified personal trainers. We want to help create a space where clients are able to find the right trainer for them. We have accounts for both clients and fitness professionals. Client accounts are always free, and we have 2 membership levels for pros. If you haven't signed up already, go to levelhealth.net and set up your membership. Thanks for listening. If you have a second, we would love it if you gave us a rating and review so that our podcast and the professionals we interview can get more exposure. You can also subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our new content. Thanks, and we hope you enjoyed the episode.
Yeah. I am incredibly grateful to get to use the podcast to talk to people like yourself and ask questions that I had as a personal trainer. I continue to see pop up within the fitness industry and everything like that. More, and specifically with you, I wanted to talk about some of the many problems that come with female physique athletes. Yes. And the approach that their coaches use, the approaches that they use, what's realistic, what's appropriate, and things like that. But before we get into that, can you give us just some background on who you are, Lauren, and why you do what you do?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I love podcasts. I love the format of podcasts. And it really allows you to go into these types of topics, right? Because this is something that is not an easy post, right? This is not like a one size fits all situation, especially when we're talking about female physique competitors. So a little background, I started competing back in 2011, did my first show. I was in my undergrad at Florida State at the time. And so I started competing. I was actually a dietetics major. And then I eventually moved over to the exercise science department, did some research there. I was helping out with some grad school research, decided that I want to continue that, ended up getting my master's at USF with Dr. Bill Campbell. At that period, I had continued to compete, and then I had switched from a figure competitor to a bikini competitor. And then I eventually turned pro in 2014, and then continued to compete as a pro during my time, during my master's. I ran my research study, which we actually just got published this year. So we looked at how different types of dieting affect weight loss and weight regain. So we looked at a meal plan versus macros, and we followed them for a fat loss period as well as a weight regain, or which is a follow-up type period. And then I had started Team Loco Fit in 2013, just started coaching, just me and just taking on a few clients here and there. And then eventually it built up, and I had built it to a place where when I did graduate in 2016 with my master's, I was able to do this full time. So I would say those first few years were just very, part-time, slowly building, which actually in hindsight is something that I'm really grateful for. Instead of, diving in too quickly and just I was able to kind of mess up on a smaller scale, right? Which is a lot easier managing that than a large scale. And then in 2018, I brought on my first coach, and now I have a team of 4 coaches. And we honestly work with wide range of clients. One thing I never really wanted to do was niche down with one type of client, and instead just use principles throughout our coaching practices that apply to everybody. So we have everyone from the top level physique competitor to performance athletes, whether that's powerlifting, CrossFit, jiu-jitsu, all of that, and just, lifestyle clients who are, looking to learn how to eat, what is protein, new moms who are really busy, so we really work with everybody, but we weave in the principles that we like throughout. And yeah, that's a quick little synopsis.
No, that's
not
great.
Sure how quick it was, but
yeah, no, I was perfect. I love hearing that it's based on principles, and I'm not going to ask about those specifically now because they're going to come up as we talk. And there is a lot that personally and selfishly I'd like to ask about your experience and research and everything like that, but I'm sure not everybody wants to hear about that. I'm going to school right now. I'm finishing my biology degree, and I'm actually in a psychology as a science course. long story short, it's doing an excellent job of making me not want to get into research because it's going into all of the background behind everything. So the one question I did want to ask though, you were at Bill Campbell's lab, and it seems like there aren't many labs like his in the world, honestly, at all. And I've loved every podcast episode I've heard of his and everything like that. But I wanted to ask, why is that lab so unique?
So I would definitely say it stems from him first and foremost, right? He is and just an incredible person. He's an incredible mentor. He's an incredible leader. Really, really smart guy. Really one of the most humble people I've ever met. I think if you ever talk to him, he's that person who like asks about you, asks you questions, is always learning from other people. It's just really incredible to like be around. And when I applied to the program, and he called me to let me know that I got in, and he was trying to tell me about the lab, and he's like, okay, we have 2 deadlift platforms and these squat racks, and he's like, I want to do female physique research. And I'm like, dude, you're fucking crazy. Like, there's like 2 chicks in my gym. Like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm on board. That sounds awesome. Like, whatever, I'm here for the vision. And I'm just really excited. Of course, that's not the direction that my research ended up going. But since then, I mean, he almost exclusively does female physique enhancement research. Like the whole, just our lab is very focused on physique enhancement, but particularly we do a lot of female focused studies, which is different, of course, than a lot of the traditional studies. And I would say that it just stems from his very, very deep interest in understanding like how to improve physique, and also just how great of a leader and a person he is. So it's not just the research interest that's unique, because it really is very, very niche, but it's also him as a person, which is why it's been so successful. And it's been really, really great to see how much the lab has grown, not just from when I got there to when I left, but especially from now, like 5 years later. I mean, it is absolutely incredible, and we're still very close. We talk very frequently, and it's so great to see how things have grown, and the research that's coming out of there is awesome.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not that other people aren't interested in it. I think he's just, like you said, he's got that X factor that he's able to kind of create this environment. Is there anything that you would have changed about your study? You don't have to go in depth. I listened to your whole Revive Stronger episode a couple times when you went in depth on it. Nice. But looking back, is there anything that you would have changed?
We've thought about this, right? And I do, just having a better facilitating education a little bit better amongst the groups, possibly. But then again, that's taking away some of what we were trying to look for. We also talked about, what if we had standardized training? But then that's, again, kind of taking away and adding other layers. So honestly, I feel like the one thing that I can concretely say that I would have loved would have just been blood work. Just out of curiosity. So that's just a monetary thing. We just didn't have the funds for it. So there's some things that I think, man, I wish I could have changed that. But honestly, there's always a give and take in research. So I feel like for what we did, it was really good. I just would have liked to seen blood work. That would have been interesting, even if it's just 2 time points, but that's money, and that's how research goes.
Exactly. And that was even years ago, before there was as much interest as there is now.
Exactly. We did the best that we could. We got salivary leptin kits, and that was atrocious, and that was a huge waste of money. But besides that, I would have liked to seen some of that. But yeah, we thought about, but we could have standardized training, because there was a fat-free mass increase in one of the groups, and we thought, okay, well, maybe it was because we looked at time. We didn't train the subjects. And that would have really reduced our subject pool, because a lot of the people who did our study were not necessarily students. A lot of them were, but some people were just in the surrounding area, and that just would have not been feasible. When you do training studies like they do at the lab, you have to go at certain times, be supervised, and you have to train there. So it gets a little challenging if you're not in that like ecosystem, you know what I mean? Whether you
and I mean, their end result, you're trying to figure out how this applied to kind of real life and free living scenarios post the actual research. So that makes sense that it wouldn't really been appropriate anyways. Are you going to be back in a lab someday? Do you have any future lines of research you're looking forward to, or no?
So I go back and forth. I think somebody who, like, once you've done this, you go back and forth with it, but I very much realized that academia was not the place for me. The just how, I don't know, bureaucratic it is with every loophole, and every little thing that you have to do is just not really my style, right? And that was a really big turnoff, to see how so many things just don't get done because of the way that it's run. So that was like, that's just, I personally don't want to do that. And I've thought about going back for a more like psych related degree, just because I'm very, very interested in that. It's really where a lot of what I do now focuses on.
Yes.
Putting it mildly, right? Whether it's like the habits or the, communication and all of that. So I've thought about it. It's not off the table completely, but it's just my life isn't at the place currently that would facilitate that. So we'll see. Never say never is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those things that, I can still help out, and still, be connected in that way, and, still able to access other research and learn. I think that's really the big thing, is that after school, and anybody who's kind of in that mindset, right, who's so used to learning all the time, if you don't go out of your way after school to continue to learn, you're always going to kind of feel like you're stagnant, right? And you have to create that time. It doesn't just happen. If you want to read research, if you want to read reviews, if you want to go to conferences and webinars, and you want to read, books, like, you have to schedule time for that, because life happens very quickly, especially when you do run a business that's so dynamic, like an online business. And that's one thing that I recognized, whoa, I really need to keep this in my life in certain ways, in order for me to feel like I'm progressing. So that doesn't necessarily, do I need to go to school for that? Or can I just, is that itch and desire just to like learn more? So that was really what I had to weigh out for myself, like all the costs and benefits of it. Like, what would that mean, for life? But yeah, so not currently, but it's never totally off the table.
Yeah, you can definitely satisfy that itch without having to be in that formal academic setting. So you have experience on stage yourself, you have experience taking athletes to stage, you have experience working with non-competitors and everything like that. And on your website, there was a couple points that I saw talking about how you feel the importance of focusing on not just competitive success, but long-term health. And I wanted to have you explain, why is that important to you? Why did you even come to that realization that you need to be thinking longer term?
Well, particularly as we're talking, I work with males too, but I would say primarily our business is mostly women. And
can I ask you on that real quick though, which one's easier to take to stage, men or women, in your opinion?
So honestly, they're just different. Men and women are just different with coaching, but I would say that you can be very directive to men as far as like, here's the program. They're like, okay. You're like, that's it. There's nothing else, typically the buy-in for a male client is higher. Like, they're not just going to like sign up for a coach right away, or they're not just going to like buy into all the principles. But once they have, I find that typically they're like, okay, cool. Like, it's just kind of good to go. Like, we're here. Of course, not always, right? Like, it's just, these are generalizations.
That's the underlying theme of this entire episode is
like there's going to be generalizations, but there's, nuance there. But I would just say, so the thing with women is that they just typically are hit a lot harder with the physiological side effects of dieting, right? Getting to stage lean levels of body fat, whether you're enhanced or not, is very, very challenging. And I would say that, of course, there's going to be some type of protective mechanism if somebody is taking, whether it's HRT or any kind of exogenous hormones. But even then, it's still going to be very, very challenging. And for men too, I'm not trying to downplay that it's not damaging, to men, but it just typically we're seeing like a storm of everything, right? We're seeing most of the time women have either dieted off and on for quite some time for a period of their life, or they've, gotten to these competition level lean, physiques a few times, and your body just kind of starts to push back. And the real issue, especially with something like the bikini division, right, is that it is a very, for lack of a better word, like normal look, right? If you wanted to be a female bodybuilder 20 years ago, that wasn't really like a normal physique, right? Like it's just, it's not. I appreciate it and love it, but like for all intents and purposes, it's not like a normal physique. Mm-hmm. And people who are striving towards that know that, and they like that, and that's what they want to look like. But there is a level of like, all right, it's going to take me years to get here. It's going to take me, like, I need to gain this much muscle mass. Bikini, a lot of it is like, you know, obviously everything in bodybuilding is genetics, but you can get there relatively faster. It's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
There's a lower barrier for people.
Lower barrier to entry. And when you get to that area, it's kind of like a look that like you like and everybody else likes. And it's kind of like, yeah, like this, I could live like this. And when you're there, it feels like you can, but oftentimes you can't. But the problem that we see is that it's not just like, oh yeah, you did a contest prep or two, but people just like show after show after show after show, and they're competing all year. They're taking a few months off, you know, to maybe rebound for a few months, and then they get right back into a diet. So they haven't really recovered from those adaptations. They haven't recovered physiologically, or let alone psychologically, which is a whole different aspect to this, right?
Absolutely.
And so it just kind of compounds. And I see this either with clients who competed a lot, as far as like compounding just adaptations, or really I see it a lot in the client who's maybe off and on, you know, yo-yo dieted for most of their life, you know, and now they're 40 and they're like, I don't know why I can't lose weight. And you're like, well, you've been doing this for 20 years and you haven't built any muscle mass.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a walk in the park to get the body that you want. So everybody's affected the same way, like relatively speaking, but physique competitors are affected much more just because of how much leaner they are. Really, body fat is the driver of all these adaptations. Mm-hmm. So the leaner you get and the longer you stay that lean, the more adaptations you're going to have. And then of course the psychological ramifications, as far as like, some people just really aren't prepared to get on stage and be judged by strangers and not necessarily win. There's one winner. That's how it works. And physique sports are subjective, right? So it doesn't matter how hard you trained, how hard you dieted. Somebody could beat you who literally dieted for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And that's just the reality. And some people just aren't prepared for that. And it's a very hard thing to balance, because you have to hold yourself to this really high standard of, I need to work really hard every day. I have these high goals that I'm trying to achieve. I'm doing this to win, because you're not just going to do this to be like, I hope that I get last place. Like, you're doing this so that you win, right? But you also have to be aware that there are other factors, and that if you don't win, that it's not a reflection on you as a person necessarily. And it's not like a shot at your self-worth. So I think that there's just a lot of compounding things with competing, that people, and that's what we just try to bring awareness to that. Like, hey, this is a really great thing. I work with so many competitors. I competed for 8 years. It's a really, really great sport for so many reasons, but asterisk, you have to be aware of these things. And a lot of the things that I've discovered, it's because I've done them myself. So, you know, I did that for years. And you can do that when your metabolism is a little more resilient. And then at some point it catches up.
Man, I have quite a few questions, and I don't want to go on this one too long, because I have one that I think would be more beneficial for people. But where do you think that a lot of that responsibility lies, on the coach or the athlete? Specifically, like understanding that there are some best practices that need to be put in place, or should be put in place, if you want to do this long term, because I do think that a lot of people jump into this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like you said, the barrier for entry for bikini athletes is lower. That doesn't mean that it's not difficult to step on stage, but it is lower. So it seems like a lot of people, women, will jump into that as almost just kind of like, it's
like this a bucket list.
Exactly. It's not at all meant to sound rude, but it's like the new couch to 5K thing. It's like this is the benchmark that they've set for themselves right out the gate. And whose responsibility is it then, if you're a coach and you bring some of these people on?
Yeah, so I'm very big on personal responsibility, just in general, but I do think that goes both ways. I think as a coach, you know, say a hypothetical situation, somebody reaches out to you, sends an inquiry and says, hey, I want to do bikini competition. I do think it's on the coach to say, hey, you know, why do you want to do this? Is this a fat loss goal? Is this just a, you know, I'm bored and I want something hard to do? Is this no, I have a burning desire to do a competition. I've been training for several years, and I really I have this goal to do this. So I think it really all stems back to the why. So I think part of it is the coach just needs to say, hey, why are you doing this? Ask just, a few simple questions there, and then really give a realistic game plan. I mean, I can't tell you how many people that have reached out who then are completely scared off when they say, hey, I want to do a show. And I'm like, all right, it'll be like a year. I'm like, what? I'm like, yes, you are not, probably eating to facilitate your goals. You're pretty inconsistent. And that's, you can get away with a lot when you're maintaining, right? People seem to forget that you can get away with a lot when you maintain. Mm-hmm. If you're actively trying to compete and you reach out to me, as a coach, I have to say, all right, we need to dial things in to be more closer to optimal. So if we're taking at least 6 months to do that, to build up, and at least 6 months to diet, that's like a rough timeline that I like to give people who have never done this before. Obviously, if somebody has competed before, it might be a little bit different. But if you're not willing to take that year, you're not ready to get on stage. Yeah. So when people hear that, they often are like, oh, okay, thanks, but no thanks. I'll go to the guy or girl who says I can get ready in 8 to 12 weeks. Yeah. And that's really where I think the issue is. So I think part of it is on the coach to just educate, hey, ask, why are you doing this? Here's a rough game plan and like a tentative timeline for you. And then it is up to the client to decide. You can't decide anything for a client. You can only just present the options. And there's times too when I'm coaching people that I'm like, hey, here's the 2 options. We either do this or we do this. What do you want to do? And here's going to be the outcomes likely for both of these. It's hard because bodies are dynamic, right? Metabolisms are dynamic, hormones are dynamic, but also, what somebody's going on, what's going on in somebody's life is dynamic. But, generally speaking, I can say, hey, we're going to push really, really hard for these few weeks, or here's what we're going to do and take more time, push the show back, etc. So I think it's just about kind of laying those options out for people, and then they have to make the decision ultimately. And also as the coach, you have to feel comfortable and confident in yourself to say, I don't feel comfortable here. I wish you all the best, but I won't guide you towards this goal.
Yeah, it seems like it all comes back to thinking a little bit longer term than just whatever the next stage appearance is. Because again, it's like, do you want to go on stage once, or do you want to potentially do this over the long term? Mm-hmm. Before we move on to...
Sorry, one thing before I forget, it does get a little dicey with national shows. So when people are trying to turn pro, but again, that's even a different discussion, right? Doing a show or 2 or trying to, turn pro, different kinds of discussions.
Yeah, if you have a show a few ones down the road,
and somebody is very competitive, right, then you have to balance too. Okay, I understand being a competitive athlete, and I understand pushing sometimes maybe a little bit that's less than optimal, but for the sake of being competitive, right, somebody could potentially win. So there has to be that balance too, to be like, hey, if we're trying to go for this is likely what's going to happen. And again, just presenting those options to somebody. We might have a shorter off season because you're going to have to start a little bit earlier. And it might be harder, right, in these ways. What do you want to do? And then you kind of leave it up to that client to decide. And as long as there's just communication there, I think it's really important. And you don't always get it right. You don't always get it right as a coach. And, you're also relying on what people are telling you. Yeah. And you have to facilitate that open dialogue with clients. But sometimes it still happens to where you're like, whoa, wait, I didn't know all of these things are going on. And sometimes,
getting that dialogue going, it's so incredibly important. And it's a skill that takes, I think, more time than a lot of fitness professionals want to put into in order to be able to, because you're right, people have to feel comfortable telling you the truth of what's happening so you can make the best decisions, or together you can make the best decisions. Before we go on to specifically some of the short-term, long-term effects psychologically of people, I wanted to ask just this one point, because this kind of, you talked about going from show to show to show to show and how that can cause problems physiologically. How long can it take for a female to recover from getting that lean? How long should they potentially take between shows?
So it's always going to be like, we don't know. And some people recover faster than others. So one thing with, again, a lot of this comes down to genetics. Some people are going to be able to maintain a leaner physique, whether they did a physique competition or not, and they have no issues, right? We all know people like that who are just lean people. Some people maintain at a higher body fat, right? And they have to get pretty low in order to get on stage. So I think for the person, the former, right, they're able to recover a little bit quicker because maybe they are only losing 10 pounds of body fat, right? And again, give or take, right? Like, but they're only doing that versus 30. And the person who lost 30 wasn't because they were a slob in the off season. It's just because that's where their body kind of settles. And that's where they are recovered physiologically and, hormonally and all of that. So I think that it's going to depend, where somebody just kind of naturally lies. But a good rule of thumb is, let's say you took 6 months of dieting, it's probably going to be a good idea to take about 6 months of an off season. Now, that is not a perfect number. You could be recovered sooner than that. It could take you longer than that. But also recovery is only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is, do you need to build more muscle? Now, I work with some clients who don't. I work with some clients who the only reason we're taking an off season is just so we're not that lean, right? Thinking of two people in my mind, and really actually a few. And we had shorter than maybe typical off seasons because they didn't necessarily need to build a lot more, right? And they were people who, just were competitive, and the way that it just kind of shook out, hey, it's going to be a shorter off season, so we might need to push a little bit harder during this next prep, but you really don't need to build anymore. And you're trying to get back on stage, right? That's a very different discussion than somebody who is being repeatedly told by the judges, like, you don't have enough muscle, you don't have enough muscle. Yeah. And everybody gains muscle at very different rates as well. So it's not just a getting lean contest, it's also a shape and like a muscular density in the right places contest. So recovery and building are typically on a different timeline. So, but I would say, as the time that you spent at least dieting, trying to take that off is going to be a good rule of thumb. And that just lets things stabilize too. We talk a lot about diet flexibility and all these types of things. And it's one of the big principles that we weave into all of our coaching. And it's really being able to, no matter how strong your relationship with food is, I don't care. It can be fucking rock solid. You get to the end of the prep and things are getting a little tough, right? Mm-hmm. But if we can start a prep at 90 or 100 and only go down to 70, that's a lot better than starting at 70 and getting down to 30, right? Just numbers. Yeah. And and I think that it's just one of those things that just takes time as well. It's not something that you can rush. You can't rush the physiological changes, and you certainly can't rush somebody's how they recover with food. And some people, it's like that, literally within a few weeks, they're like, oh, good to go. And that was because we put in a lot of work beforehand. Mm-hmm. Other people, even if you have put in that work beforehand, sometimes it just post-show hits you really hard. And that's because there's just so many factors that are influenced. So I think it just really, again, it's going to depend on the client. But good rule of thumb, you spend about 6 months dieting. Let's look to at least spend 6 months off.
Yeah, you look at for example, this is obviously not applicable to everybody, but you look at the natural bodybuilders that are stepping on stage mm-hmm. once every 3 to 4 years, it's an Olympics, and it's okay, that's the extreme end. However, yes. it is good to note that is, these are survival mechanisms, right? They're trying to keep us alive physiologically, and then we have all types of psychological stuff that we want to talk about next, but. It's interesting that you see some very, I want to say, obsessive behavior around food post-show. And I don't know if I'm just not seeing it on my social media as much or what. I think I'm in a little bit of a microcosm in terms of people that are thinking a little bit long-term and evidence-based and considering these behavioral aspects of things. So I don't get as much of the 5,000 calorie cookie that's just covered in nonsense and cereal and stuff. But I definitely have seen that quite a bit in the past. So it's just all, I think it just comes down to like, these are all survival mechanisms that are trying to keep us alive. And
Exactly.
unfortunately they aren't super useful now, although they have been quite a bit in the past. So all right, moving on to, I mean, every single talk that I've had with people so far, it seems like everything keeps coming back to when you're working with people, you have to be considering the psychological side of things. So that's what I wanted to touch on next. What are some of the acute, the short-term psychological effects of getting on stage? And then what are some of the potentially long-term effects?
Yeah. So I would say, first, like we already just touched on, is this decline in your relationship with food. And again, it doesn't matter how strong it is in the off season. And we work really, really hard with clients on that. It's like a big focus of our team. But there is a level of, and this is actually what I studied. So in grad school, we looked at, there's two different types of restraint. So there's flexible restraint and rigid restraint. And the idea of having flexible restraint is being more moderate, being able to plan, less impulsive, et cetera, et cetera. And then black and white, rigid thinking is more like black and white thinking, very off and on mentality with food. So we really try and work on that flexible restraint with clients. But no matter how flexible you are, at some point in a prep, you need to be very dialed in, right? Like things become very robotic, things become very black and white. Oh, I can have this, I can't have that. And it actually makes it kind of easier for a little while, because it really like eliminates the choices, and that can be very freeing for people. So there are ways to kind of hack that, so to speak, in other aspects too. But so at some point though, because of the lower calories and because of the lower body fat, really, it's more about that, things, you're always just a little bit more edgy, right? Things are always kind of, like you said, like that more like survival mechanism, and everybody responds differently here. Some people lose and they're fine. Other people, it's like pulling fucking teeth to get them leaner. And that's again, because of where your body kind of wants to settle naturally. So I would say that there's going to be some type of decline with your relationship with food, most likely because you do need to be very dialed in. There are going to be sacrifices that need to be made. And I'm very big on, like, when I used to travel, I used to prep and I would travel all the time. I would still eat out. There's people who like never eat a meal out. I'm like, blow me. I travel way too much for this. You know what I mean? And when I would go out to eat, I would order like, fish or like a lean steak and like steamed vegetables. Like, it didn't mean that it was like the most glamorous meal, but like you can make that work pretty much anywhere, right? But there are going to be sacrifices. There are going to be things. Hey, I got to wake up early and I got to do this cardio. Hey, I got to eat this stuff when I, maybe don't want to, et cetera, et cetera. So there are going to be just kind of changes with your relationship with food. And I would also say too, just like you have to put a lot of effort into it. And I would say that always should be off balanced by having other things in your life. The clients who have the best success with prepping typically have lives and careers outside of fitness, in my experience, or they just have a lot of other things going on, right? And not everybody, of course, just generalizations, but when somebody has whether it's a different life or they're just very busy, they have other stuff going on, it's less like there's less time to worry and fret over, did the scale drop today, right? Because they don't really have time for that. They have to take care of their kids or their family, or they have to go to their job and whatever. And not saying that people who are in the fitness space aren't busy and aren't working hard, but it's already so layered into that. So it's like fitness, nutrition, all this stuff all the time with their clients and them. It can be kind of really hard to like, you like almost lose yourself, and that becomes the only thing you have going on. So that's one of those maybe like long-term kind of like insidious changes that I see, is that when people don't have anything else to ground them, this is what becomes that thing, and competing becomes it, but like not in a healthy way, you know what I mean? So people who are drawn to competing are probably going to be generally speaking, type A, a little more neurotic, very driven, very like high dopamine chasing stuff. Like that's just kind of be like extremist. Like that's going to be the person who is interested in doing this, right? Not always, but a lot of times. And I think that the constant chase of like the next show, the next placing, the next this, it really like goes into that like, behavioral system. And it can really produce some negative side effects for people, meaning like, I just got to do one more show. I'll win next time, or this, that. It's like you almost become like that gambler who's like, I'll get it next time, and it becomes like this obsession. And when you don't have other things to ground you, it can be really hard to see, and so yeah, I would say that that's kind of one of the longer term changes. And then of course, like we touched on a little bit in the beginning, if you're not prepared to be judged by strangers, and possibly not win, and you're looking at that as a knock on like your self-worth, or like you as a person, or your effort, then you're going to be in for some shit, because then you're always going to be going back to that to look to fulfill that like gap, because you feel like you didn't get it. And it's a futile chase, because like I said, it doesn't matter. I don't care. It's not a hard work contest. Like, you have to work really hard, but you're not rewarded solely on that. And that's something that is a really hard thing to swallow. You get up there and you're like, fuck, this person literally is like, this is my first show. And they're like winning the whole thing. You're like, I've been up here for 6 years and I'm getting overlooked, or whatever it might be, and it's one of those things that I would never expect somebody to like work really hard for something and then like they don't necessarily get the outcome that they want, and be like, okay, like, no, like, you're going to be a little upset, like, that's okay, you're going to be a little downtrodden right after, a little disappointed, and kind of feel that twinge of like, oh, this sucks, but then you got to move forward. You can't hold yourself to like, oh, me as a person is not good because I didn't win this. And I think that's really where that kind of distinction is, of like, tying your self-worth to the placings, especially with something that is subjective. And I think I was partly maybe, I don't know, used to this, I guess is the word. I'm trying to think of the word, but I grew up riding horses and showing horses, and that's very subjective. So it is one of those things that, while it's clearly not the same thing, there were I was kind of conditioned to that, and then I did other sport, I did track and cross country in high school, and that was very, hey, you crossed the finish line first or you didn't. That was a lot more clear cut. But then when I got into bodybuilding, again, it kind of became that very subjective, sport again. And it certainly would bother me at times, but I guess I just had more experience with it. But some people don't. And that is one of those things that I think long term, if you don't prepare yourself for that, and you don't have these other things to ground you, that can be a really, really tough thing to get out of.
I think that obviously this is well outside of my scope to say for sure, but I think one of the important things for spiritual development is detaching from the outcome of whatever you're pursuing. Because if you, like you said, it's not a hard work contest. A lot of people treat it like it is. And I think that that subjective nature can potentially be discouraging for people. But on the flip side of that, perhaps it's really just a good reason to not do the absolute most, do not make it any harder on yourself than you need to do it, than it needs to be emotionally or physically. Because you're right, like, somebody could step on stage having done a 6-week prep, half-ass 6-week prep, and place equal to you or above you, just because the way that their body's shaped different, naturally, how lean they are naturally, their muscle bellies, everything could go into that. So it's like, you're not in control of the outcome. And I think a lot of people can cause problems for themselves because there are these inherent issues. And if you don't accept that, the end goal is really, you can do the best that you possibly can, bring your best package to stage, but at the end of the day, it's not really up to you anyway. So
100%. And it is something that I think that you learn over time, the more that you do it. But those first few experiences can be really, really jarring for people, and it's hard for them to get out of that. And I think it also, you have to look at it, okay, who am I outside of this, right? A lot of times people will start competing and they become really, really attached to it. And, you just having other things that, you recognize in yourself, that can all still make you a great competitor. But it's not like you are just a competitor. And I think this happens in a lot of, like, people have these, like, awakenings, right? Like at different points in their life. I think like when I graduated, I was kind of like, who am I? I've been a student for like up until this point my whole life, and I'm not going to be a student anymore. Because, school, especially stuff like, master's degree and all that, it's a very nice level of like just enough structure, but like you kind of get to do what you want, you know, like it was like this nice thing, but you always had something, right, like to guide you. And now it's kind of like I don't have this like North Star anymore of like what am I doing. And at that point I also was like very hurt and couldn't really train, and you know, certainly not competing. So now I'm like, what? Not competing, not doing school, like who am I, what am I doing? And I think it was, you know, it's definitely challenging, but it was important that I, you know, went through that. Was able to recognize, okay, I'm not just those things. I have other qualities about me, and those qualities can make me successful in, you know, XYZ. But I think that if you don't have that recognition, it will be very challenging. And also, you know, to be fair, I think sometimes people just have to go through that stuff. You can prep them for it. They can, you know, whether it's me or another coach or a different podcast or whatever, you know, I love sharing insights with people so that they can have an idea of like what to expect. But we've all heard this, you know, you kind of have to go through it yourself. And I think that is true to some degree. I do think that there are certain things that like people can definitely avoid, like, hey, here are some really shitty practices we should probably avoid. Let's not do those. Especially in the bodybuilding world, there's like a lot of very scary practices that people will engage in. So like, let's avoid those. We know that they're not good, but sometimes, you know, you can say it in 100 different ways. And until somebody experiences that kind of like low and then brings themselves up, you know, a lot of this relates back to dopamine too. You know, I mean, well, everything relates back to dopamine, let's be honest, but, and it's just, that people always think of dopamine as just like something that's pleasurable, right? Which it is involved with pleasure, but it really is involved also with like the
goal seeking
behaviors. So, and that almost can have just as much of an impact. Like some of the research has shown that like the act of seeking is almost as dopaminergic as the act of doing it, right? So sometimes it's really hard to separate those two, right? And you're always going after what is going to create more of that dopamine, like change from baseline, right? But then there's always going to be the inevitable, you want to get that peak, but then after that peak, there's always going to be like that crash. So if you're always, you know, if you're not careful, you're always seeking the next show, the next thing, the next trophy, and then it becomes, you like look up and you're like, whoa, what have I been doing for all this time? I don't know.
And then this is all interweaved into the incredibly dopamine releasing effects of social media. So it's like this,
yeah.
You have that on the micro scale, and then on the macro scale you have these large things that then you put on social media, and then you get the hits and the likes, and it's like, oh man, it's very interesting. I've always this isn't my quote at all, but learning from other people's mistakes, because you can't make them all on your own, I think that's incredibly valuable. And yes. Fortunately, though everyone does not always air their mistakes out there, we do live in a time where you can learn from a lot of people's mistakes. So that's awesome. I mean, long conversations like this, get that out there for people. So these next two questions kind of go together. So and we've touched a lot on major obstacles for female athletes already, and I'm sure we'll hit a few more. I wanted to get something that can give some practical advice to people that maybe they don't have a coach, whether they're stepping on stage or not. I think these all then apply. What are some key aspects that you consider with every I'm not even going to say physique competitor, because I don't want to get it that close, but every client that you work with regards to, you know, the program design, their life, what kind of feedback do you get from them, things like that?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that the most important thing, which I think is just so undervalued, is having this diet flexibility. And when I say that, a lot of people go, no. Like there's two camps. There's either that's not hardcore enough camp, I can do more. Or there's like yeah, just do whatever you want, do whatever feels good. There's two sides to this. And it's like, no, there is like a happy middle part. So having diet flexibility does not mean that you are off of a plan, right? You can have a very structured plan, but still be flexible within that plan. And this is really the key thing that I've noticed with people who are able to have long-term success, whether they're a physique competitor or a lifestyle client. So say, you know, that you plan to eat 4 meals a day that have protein. And obviously those sources are going to change, and you pretty much, you know, you prep stuff and you have it good to go. Well, guess what? Maybe you're traveling, maybe your food spoils, maybe you can't bring anything with you. Maybe a last minute something comes up at work and you have to eat. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Does that mean that you don't eat? Does that mean that you binge eat? Does that mean that you have compensatory behaviors afterwards? Or does it mean that you make the best choice available and you're within like a 90% confidence interval? That sounds a lot better to me as a coach and for long-term progress, because what happens is life is always going to show up. So it doesn't matter what your goals are or how structured or how perfectly planned things are, something is going to happen. And if you can't make that decision because you are crippled with anxiety or fear that it's not going to be 100% perfect on plan, and you oscillate between this 0 to 100, off and on behavior, you're never going to be successful regardless of your goal. So this goes for surplus, maintenance, or a deficit. It does not matter if you're not able to pivot and make adjustments. Might not be exactly what you wanted or exactly what was prescribed, but if we're really close, that is what I really want to see with clients. Now, are there times where it's like, hey, maybe you need to prep some more food because you've been kind of like fucking off recently, and like you haven't been like, you just haven't gotten your shit together? That is a reasonable thing to say, like, we need to dial things in. Why is this not happening? Right. Why aren't you prepping stuff? Oh, I didn't have time to grocery shop. Okay. I didn't have time to prep food. Okay. Well, have you had groceries? Can you get groceries delivered? That's a good option. Have you looked into a meal prep company? You don't need that for every meal, but you can have that for a few meals. What about some local places that you can go and eat? I have a few places that, like, if I'm just don't even want to cook or have time to cook, that are like still like quality food, I can go and I can grab something. What about places like that near your work, near your house? So we have a few backup options. It's not always like, oh, I didn't have time, so then I decided to go and eat this every day. Well, why? No, there's other solutions. So let's create the solution from the problem. So sometimes it is about dialing things in. Other times it's about the person who, like, oh, somebody asked me to go to lunch and I just can't because I don't know what's going to be there. What do you mean you don't know what's going to be there? Almost every single restaurant, especially if we're talking about in the United States, and even, even in other countries, but obviously less options in certain places, you can order almost anything that will make it work. Like almost anything. Again, doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly what you wanted. Doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly what you had planned on eating. But I can't tell you how many times I've been to very extravagant, calorie dense places, or even places like an IHOP, right? Where you're like, okay, I'm not normally going to IHOP to like be a health focused person. But guess what? IHOP does have egg whites. They do have veggies. They do have, plain toast. And you maybe have to make some concessions and make some adjustments. And maybe that isn't exactly what was on your plan. But it's a lot better than being like, you know what, I'm going to get the triple stack of pancakes and put everything on it. And you know what, for the rest of the day now, because I ate that for breakfast, I'm just going to eat whatever I want for the rest of the day. So those are the types of things that I really think are important for people to understand for long term. And it doesn't matter what your goals are, and it doesn't matter where your food is at, really. It can be, like I said, all the way from a surplus to a deficit. But being able to have that flexible mindset when it comes to food, training as well. But I would say that for food, people really struggle with that a lot more. And it's because, realistically, you're probably going to train 4 times a week, 3 to 5 times a week, maybe go on some walks, like maybe do some cardio. But you're eating multiple times a day. So it's going to be you're confronting that a lot more. So that's why we really, really try to focus on that. And also taking the client's life into account. There's not one way to coach. And that's something that, when I first started, and I think when most people first start, they have their preferred methods. And that's, of course, like we always go back to like, okay, what is optimal versus like what is actually going to, move the needle forward, right? Because optimal would be 100%. But let's say we can get to 90 and we achieve 90 for like 6 months. That's going to be really, really good versus, again, hitting 100 some days, hitting 0 on other days. So it's about recognizing like what's going on in that client's life and making those adjustments. And it's not to say that you are either, you're not going too easy on, you're not being like, everything's going on, like, you don't need to do anything right now. No, that's not useful either, because when life is very chaotic, people do need a few things to ground them. But those things that ground them might look a little bit different than the more optimal plan that they maybe were on a few months ago. So I think as a coach, being able to not only teach this type of flexibility with their mindset, but also be flexible yourself with your methods. And, you know, when you're a new coach, this is hard. Or anytime you're trying to employ something new, it's hard. But I would just share that with the client. Hey, you know, based on your situation, this is something that I think could work. Why don't we try it for a few weeks and then go from there? You know, being open with that client that like, this isn't like some tried and true thing. Like you're like, hey, we're going to be working through this together. But I have a feeling based on these factors that this is going to be useful for you. And then we can make adjustments from there. There's nothing that is like set in stone with coaching.
Yeah.
Like that's the cool thing. And that's what's great about it. Whether you have a weekly check-in or maybe a bi-weekly, you know, like 2 a month, whatever it is, you know, you can make a plan and then make some adjustments. You know, it's not set in stone forever. So teaching the client to be flexible with, you know, their methods while still sticking to the plan, and also as the coach, being flexible with those methods as well.
So this episode just came full circle because it comes back to principles again, right? So like you said, depending on the context of that person's life, what training inputs do you need to achieve the desired output? Again, within the context of that individual, and then also what nutrition inputs, and then like how can you best achieve that within the constraints created by all of the inevitable facts of life, really. And you said you're in the middle. It's funny because it seems like that's where all the best people are now, and it's it's because, I mean, that's really where the majority of people are. Like the extremes do exist and they are very visible. However, that's not necessarily where the majority of people are.
But even in the extremes, even that's where I argue this, even in a competitive physique athlete or a top level athlete, you are not going to make it very far or very long if you can't make any pivots. So again, this is not to say, like, if you are a top level athlete, you need to be striving to be as optimal as possible, as much as possible. But you can't fool yourself into thinking that that nothing is going to come up. There's going to be a night where maybe you don't get the best sleep. You need to figure out what to do the next day, right? You can't let that cripple you. There's going to be times where something happens to your food or you don't have access to it. What are you going to do? There's going to be times where you get to a gym if you're traveling and it's not what you thought it was. Are you going to have a meltdown? Are you going to like there has to be a way to pivot. Obviously, if we're talking about like high level professional athletes, clearly this is a different discussion because they have lots of money and it doesn't really matter, you know, like that's all taken care of for them, right? We're talking about, you know, what, like within this context, there's going to be things that come up in your life, you know, and how are you going to handle that, you know? And instead of just completely falling off, and this is, like I say this from experience, you know, I'm a very off and on person just in general, you know. I think a lot of people, again, who get into this have that proclivity to be like that, which is why they're drawn to these types of things. But I've had to work really hard to try and be more moderate in a way that isn't like letting myself off the hook, because that's what I think can happen, right? Like in this process, you're like, yeah, I don't really feel like training today. That's not how this works. You know what I mean? This isn't about like, oh, I don't feel like doing this. Like there's a lot of times where I don't feel like eating what I'm eating. Even now, you know, I'm like, this really isn't that great of a meal, but like, I just got to get it in. This is going to work for my goals. And like, we're going to keep it moving. So it's not always about like that. It's just about like, you have to have that flexibility because something is going to come up. Like, you know, if you have kids or you have, you know, a family that you're taking care of, or, you know, like your pet needs to go to the emergency room and they're, oh my God, now I can't train today. Like, are you going to let that cripple you for a week? Or are you going to figure out what to do the next day? Yeah. So I would even argue in the extremes, having flexibility with your mindset while still sticking to the goal as optimal as possible is going to be the best move.
Yeah, having that safety valve, I think, is incredibly important. And then also pros and physique sports are kind of unique in terms of pro athletes, because like how many of them are actually making any money or enough money to where they don't have to think about these kind of things. So, all right. So my very last question, I wanted to get it done so we could go and get on with the rest of your day. How do you feel that coaches that work with female physique athletes can improve overall? What are some action items?
So, you know, I would say that working there's two extremes. Like, there's always the extremes, right? Of either like the coach that is too empathetic, too I don't want to say easy on people, but just like rah and like all like, yeah, you go girl, like you're doing. That's not really that helpful. You know what I mean? If you're just saying those things without really any substance, that's not really being supportive to somebody's goals. That's just kind of reinforcing like, and making them feel like a short-term, like positive type feelings, like elated. That's not really going to help for any kind of long-term. But to the flip side of that, being too short, being too like, yep, that's what you need to do, and don't ask me questions because I said so, like that, like those two extremes, I think are a real big disservice for everybody, not just female clients, but for everybody. But I think a lot of times people are under the impression that because women are more emotional, again, just broad strokes here, guys, that women tend to be more emotional, that they need to play only into that. And I would say that you need to balance that. You know, you need to say, hey, you know, be empathetic, be intuitive, be supportive, but also pushing people, also being direct. So I would say it's not really, I don't really have one specific thing that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what people need to do for female clients, but really having that good balance of not being one or the other in terms of, you know, maybe not pushing someone enough, but also just like being, you know, kind of cold and like not giving them really any background on like what they're doing. I don't know if that really was a good answer, but I don't really like to say things like, oh, men versus women. Like, I feel like that's just, that whole conversation gets so tough because there's just so much there that I'm like, I don't really like to specify too much for people.
Yeah, you have to be careful because I mean, what people might do is hear something that you say, as you know, and just take it completely out of context and be like, Lauren said this.
Yeah. And it's like, in my opinion, there are differences, but there's not that many differences. You know, it's more about differences between clients, less about sex differences, I've found. Yeah. I have some men that I've worked with that are very emotional. I've had some women that I work with who are almost like too cold and distant, or you're like, oh, I don't know what's going on. Like, right. And then vice versa. So I find that there's just more inter-client variability versus like sex variability. And I think that if people just focused on the client and they were able to blend being, you know, empathetic and being intuitive and asking questions and caring about what's going on in somebody's life, but also holding them to a standard, being direct, you know, setting goals and those types of things. So it's really balancing that kind of masculine and feminine energy with, you know, want to like, you know, however you want to take that. But I don't know.
Is that mirrored kind of by what, now that there is a lot more research in terms of sports science being done on women, is that kind of mirrored in that research? What I mean by that is like the physiological effects of training and everything. The within sex differences, like individual differences, are bigger than the across sex differences. Is that what we're seeing?
I'm not super comfortable with that research. Like I don't know that like very, very well. So I don't want to comment and say something wrong. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, of course.
But I would say that just in general, like a lot of this comes down to like personality stuff. And again, these are generalizations, but like women and men are more similar than they're different, but they are different on very certain things, like very specific markers, you know, not always. But typically women are going to be more agreeable, men are going to be less agreeable. That's really like a big one that we see kind of consistently in the literature. And I would say that that's, you know, most people can probably see that play out in life.
Sometimes kind of common knowledge does play out, but not always. But
I would say that that's really like the biggest difference that like I kind of have seen as far as like literature goes. But again, I think that as a coach, if you just want to be a better coach, you need to listen to your clients and you need to recognize what they need and again, going back to coach being flexible, the coach needs to be flexible too, because sometimes the client, you know, you might have a client who is, you know, you're pretty direct with, you're pretty whatever. Some weeks they need a little bit more like a little pick me up, you know, some weeks they're really down, some weeks they have a lot going on. And then other weeks, you know, you might have a client who's like really in their head, really overly emotional, being so clouded, their judgment is just so clouded. And you'd be like, hey, you need to be a little bit harsher that week, and not in like a demeaning way whatsoever, but in a more practical way. Like, hey, here's what's going on. Let's get out of this just pure emotion and get back to some logic. So it's all about balancing those things. And I think that that's what all coaches can focus on, whether they're coaching men or women, and whether they are men or women coaches. And I think that, both sexes do a really great job of coaching, and I think it's just going to be different. There's just going to be a little bit of a different understanding. But yeah, you really just have to understand your client.
Yeah. So I think we can wrap this up with the statement that consider that you are working with a dynamic individual. What works today is not going to work for tomorrow. What works for one client is not going to work for the next client necessarily. So there's just a consideration that needs to occur no matter who you're working with, that things are going to change. But all right, Lauren, well, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you answering a lot of these questions. And we look forward to seeing what your team of coaches does in the future.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys got a lot out of this discussion. And yeah, love to come back on if there's any follow-up questions.